Hello, everyone. Happy to be here today. My name is Morgan Daimler. I have been an author with Moon Books for a little over a decade. I've written a variety of books, mostly about Irish mythology, witchcraft, and fairies. And I am here today as part of Mooncon 2024 talking about the Irish Aos Sí. So, that's a little about who I am and why I'm going to be talking to you today. The Aos Sí, first of all, we kind of have to start with a little bit of a definition for who the Aos Sí are, what the term means, and I think this lays a good groundwork for a better understanding of the wider topic. So, when we're talking about the Aos Sí, obviously this is a term from the Irish language. Ish is a word which you'll see spelled a couple ways. The modern version is AOS. The older version you'll also see sometimes as AES. It can be pronounced anywhere from like ice to ace, depending on the dialect and which type of Irish we're talking about here. And it's a word that just means people. It tends to imply people of a more like noble status, important people, if you will, but it's generally just translated as people. She, Sidhe, is the spelling you're going to see the most often. That is the older archaic spelling, but it is used in modern sources as well. Oftentimes to differentiate, I think, from homophones in the Irish language, there's the modern spelling for this word would be SI with a fada, an accent mark over it. And that word is also used for several other words. So people tend, from what I've seen, to often go with the older spelling in order to help differentiate and be clear that this is what they're talking about. The word she itself refers to the otherworldly hills or mounds. Sometimes you'll see them called fairy hills or fairy mounds that these beings are associated with. So, is she people of the otherworldly hills or mounds? You will also see, and this is sort of a slang that's come into effect in the last 20 or 30 years, people simply referring to these beings as the she. Now, properly, as we just established in Irish, that would be talking about the place, the hills themselves. However, you do see it used sort of as a shorthand for the beings. And people don't always say Aos Sí or Athena she, which is another term that means people of the otherworldly hills. They'll just say the she, meaning the beings, the people. So hopefully that's not too confusing. Important, though, to kind of understand where the term is coming from, the language that it's coming from, and the way that it is used and can be used. This is often in English given as fairies. I personally try to avoid that as much as possible because it, I think, causes some confusion. When we hear the word fairy in English, we make a lot of assumptions. There's a lot of sort of preconceived notions, especially in popular culture, about who and what a fairy is that is very at odds with who and what the Irish Aos Sí are. But again, just so everyone's aware, you will run across the term. You will see people referring to these beings as fairies interchangeably, including in Irish sources that are in the English language. So, yes, it is a little bit confusing, but all important groundwork to kind of understand moving forward. So, the reason I like to start with a definition, besides the fact that I just love semantics and I love the Irish language, is that I think it helps establish what the topic is because it is a topic that causes so much confusion. So when we're talking about the Aos Sí, we're specifically talking about these beings that come from or exist in the other world. And through the she, the otherworldly hills or mounds, which act as entranceways or gateways or portals for these beings to travel back and forth between the human world and An Ella, the other world, the world they come from. And in doing this, they are residents sort of both. And there's a lot of discussion and opinions and thoughts about the other world and what that is and how that relates to the human world. That would be a separate presentation, so we're not going to get into that here. But just important to keep in mind, there's really no set definitive understanding of this. There's just a variety of ideas and thoughts. And that is true for the Aos Sí as well. So when we do talk about them, and I mentioned we call them the Aos Sí, I mentioned in English they're also called fairies. Both of those terms in some places are seen as things that you don't really want to say. You don't want to use those names because it could get their attention, which is not necessarily a good thing in all cases, or most cases. And also, particularly the term fairies in English, but also in some areas of Ireland, the term she as well. They're thought to be words that these beings don't like. They don't like being called this. They don't like these terms. They don't like it being applied to them. And they can become offended if they happen to be nearby or in the vicinity and hear you speaking about them. So what we find is a wide range of euphemisms. And the euphemisms also tell us a lot about these beings. Although it's important to understand the euphemisms are not generally meant to be descriptions, or they're not meant to actually be who and what these beings are. Euphemisms are used, they're a term that is intentionally particularly flattering or kind or something that would be seen as polite in order to both show that you're being respectful to them and also to kind of remind them that they're capable of being nice or good or friendly, which is not things that they necessarily always are when it comes to humans. So a lot of the euphemisms we see are things like, for example, I mentioned the Theta She is another term for them, the people of the fairy hills. That wouldn't be a euphemism, it's just another name. But a euphemism very similar to that is Nathina Waha, and Nathina Waha means the good people or the good folk in English. Nathina Ushla, the noble people. You also sometimes see them referred to as Nahushla, which just means the gentry. Again, rough translations into English from the Irish. Nathina Ella, the other people. In English, you'll also see them sometimes referred to as the other crowd. Themselves is a pretty common way they'll get referred to in Ireland, and that's becoming more popular elsewhere as well. So we see this range of terms, and there's many, many more. I'm just giving kind of a little sample here, all of which are meant to sort of remind these beings that they can be the good folk. They can be the shining ones. That maybe is a little more descriptive. They're the nobility, the gentry, flattering terms, so that if they happen to be around and hear these things being said, they will perceive you as being respectful, and they'll also be maybe flattered or pleased with the terms that you're using. So all of that kind of starts us on a picture of who and what these beings are. They are beings that exist in a separate reality or separate world, but have the ability to come into the human world and interact with us. They can potentially be helpful. They can also be harmful or dangerous. And we have a range of stories that sort of show both of these things happening. So they require our respect. And some of this is because when we talk about the Aos Sí, to be clear, it's a sort of a general term that encompasses a whole group or range of beings. Some of those beings are the Tuatha Dé Danann, the old Irish gods, who are thought to have gone into the Sidhe, gone into the otherworldly hills when humans first came to Ireland, and are now incorporated into and part of that population. We also have some references in mythology to the Fomorians. The Fomorians are sort of these chthonic, dangerous beings that predate the Tuatha Dé Danann in Ireland, the gods, and have interactions with them, sometimes good, sometimes bad. So in some sources, we see the Fomorians referenced as members of the Sidhe. We see them as this sort of third group in Irish mythology that isn't any of these main named God-associated groups. Not the Tuatha De Danann, it's not the Hawaiians, it's not the Firbolg. It's this separate group of beings. In those cases, they're very associated with a particular deity named Manannan MacLear. He is eventually incorporated into the Tuatha De Danann in stories, but in the oldest material, he is his own entity. He is referred to as a king of the otherworld, specifically the otherworld as it exists in a series of islands in the west and in the sea around Ireland. And he is sort of his own separate kingdom. And this is where the idea of the Aos Sí, the people of the Sidhe, kind of initially seems to be coming in. When the Tuatha De Danann go into the Sidhe after humans come to Ireland, it is Manannan, in one of the main stories about this, who teaches them how to live in the other world. He teaches them how to survive there, how to be immortal there. He teaches them how to pass invisibly in the human world so that they can continue to come and interact in Ireland, even though they are now no longer living in it in the same sense they had been previously. So Manannan is this very key figure, this key person who is the king of the other world and also the one who seems to understand it and the way it works and how to integrate new people into that. So we have this whole wide range of beings that fall into that third grouping, the Manannan grouping, that are not the Tuatha De Danann, not Hawaiians. They are something different and something separate. And it's very important to understand all this, that there's layers to this. It's not a simple, straightforward subject. It's not something where we have one clear answer to, yes, this is who these beings are. And it's important to understand that because there are a lot of sources out there that will say simply that the Aos Sí are the Tuatha De Danann, that the Tuatha De Danann went into the Sidhe and became the Aos Sí, and that it's just a 1 = 1 situation. And a lot of this comes from material that started coming out in the late 19th century with the so-called the Celtic revival, the revival of Irish culture through sources like W.B. Yeats, A.E. Russell, Lady Gregory, Lady Wilde, people who were writing kind of around that time period. That prior to that, when we look at the older sources, when we look at the idea of who the Aos Sí were, they're really considered an entire huge population. They are potentially everywhere. They are invested in a lot of different places, these notable Sidhe, as well as there's trees that are associated with them. They used to be called fairy trees in Ireland. There's islands, there's different sorts of physical locations that are connected to these beings. And there's a whole range of ways that they can appear and manifest and interact with people, for positive and negative. They're described as existing in a culture that would have been very similar to Irish culture of the time or slightly prior to the time. They would have a king or a queen. They would have a royal court. They would have knights and poets, but they would also have farmers and general warriors and, people who would take care of the cattle. And, in some of the references we find in mythology, there's references to, characters and stories who are members of the Sidhe who are, blind or can't walk or, it's an entire societal range of people is what I'm trying to get across here. It's not just the nobility. It's not just the Tuatha De Danann who went in as gods and sort of maintained this status quo and status. It is actually this entire society with a complete range of what you would expect in a human society for the different roles that are filled and the different people that you're going to find. And it's a huge wide range. And they were understood to be a multitude, just a huge number. There's one source, and this is, to be fair, I believe a 19th century source, but it talks about the Aos Sí as populous as flowers in a field, or blades of grass in a meadow. This idea that they were a huge number of them and they were everywhere. But when this cultural revival happened, and the Tuatha in particular kind of were revived in the popular consciousness, and people started writing about the Aos Sí again. And by people, I mean more like the aristocracy, the learned people, the folklorists, all of that class of people. They were writing about specifically the named beings, the members of the Tuatha that we were aware of, that are referenced still today, even in folklore. And what happened is this impression started to come across that there actually were not a huge number of them, that there were a limited number of them, and that they were mostly the more famous ones, the ones that were more remembered, more continued in stories. And so the whole perspective on them in the wider popular culture kind of started to move from this is a nation of beings, a multitude of beings, to this is a select group of beings. And that really changed kind of the wider way they were understood. Now, that's not to say you can't still find people who understand them as, as populous as the, rain falling from the sky, to use a different analogy. I don't want to keep picking on blades of grass. Not that you can't still find sources and people even today that will talk about them that way, as if they're just this huge multitude. But it definitely moved the needle on the way they were publicly perceived, so that they were narrowed down in many ways. And I hope that people can be more open-minded to the idea of this multitude of beings. One thing that I often talk about when we're talking about the Aos Sí is how do they look, how do they appear? And you have to keep that definition in mind in order to understand how wide the range is in their appearances. Now, we do have stories that talk about them looking very human, and the full range of human that you can imagine. We have some particular definitions that describe hair colors, blonde, red hair, dark hair, not as much with eye color. Eye color tends to most often be green. I don't know why. That just is how they tend to be in the mythology. We don't have a lot of descriptions in the myth to work with, but the ones that we do have. So beautiful, very human-like. But then we have other accounts where they're described as being, human in appearance, but only 2 or 3 feet tall. We have other accounts where they appear in different animal forms. Very human mentality, but in the form of an animal. And we have quite a few references to these beings as shapeshifters. The idea that their form is really at their own discretion. They can appear as they choose to appear. So gives you a lot of options for how you might see them or how they might be described, how they might be. We particularly tend to see them in stories in the more human interactions, particularly the mythology. But the folklore, we tend to see them described in a much wider range. There's an account of the fairy queen Una out in Galway, which talks about her appearing, trying to terrify someone. But she appears as this sort of amorphous, constantly shifting, like nightmare. And she can also appear in the form of a giant cow. In contrast, we see, for example, Mannanan in one of the main stories that he kind of features in. He features in a lot of stories because he's very popular, but one of the main stories that he features in, he encounters a human man. Mannanan is coming from the other world into the human world, and the human man is traveling out of the human world on this Imram, this sea voyage. And he tells the human man that he is currently in the shape, the form of a man for the purpose that he is going to Ireland to achieve. The implication there, however, is that this is not his true form or true appearance. It's just the shape he happens to be in for this purpose. So I think it's fairly safe to say that the majority of these beings are capable of changing their appearance and appearing however they choose to in any given situation. And that's something the folklore backs up. It talks about them being able to either physically change themselves, according to some sources, or according to other sources, able to affect the human mind in a way that it causes us to perceive them differently and in the way that they want to be perceived. So gives us an entire range of options with how you might see them. Now, I've mentioned a couple times the idea of them being around and maybe overhearing conversations. And I did mention when I was talking about Manana and teaching the Tuatha how to live in the other world, that he taught them how to pass invisibly. This is actually a pretty important thing that we see across the whole range of belief and mythology. The idea that the Aos Sí and later the Tuatha, once they have joined the Aos Sí, are able to be in the human world but invisible or imperceptible to humans. And this is sort of a key factor of both belief and of who these beings are. They can potentially be around you at any time. You will not be aware they are there. You cannot see them or hear them. They are blocked from human perception, but they can be there. And we have several different stories in folklore that talk about people who were disrespectful, who were saying rude things, that they, didn't believe in the good folk, and that they weren't concerned about them and weren't afraid of them, and that the good folk didn't matter, and just, an array of insulting things. And of course, the good folk overhear this, and then of course it does not go well for the human being after that because the good folk are offended. So the idea is always to try to speak respectfully because you don't know if they might be around. It's also why the idea of euphemisms is so important, because you don't know for sure if they could be around. So on top of the various physical appearances that we do have for them, there's also this idea that they can be around and invisible. Now, I do want to be clear because this causes a lot of confusion today, and this is something that's coming in from an outside influence kind of over the last 100 years. But the idea that the good folk are intangible is really foreign to the Irish belief, at least. It was always believed that the good folk, that the Aos Sí, were physical beings. They could be physical in this world. They could physically interact with humans. They could physically interact with animals, the world, trees, rocks, whatever. In the same exact way that a human being might. They could simply be invisible, but they were not invisible because they were intangible. Those were two completely separate kind of concepts. And to kind of give an example of this, it's a very old folk tradition. If you're going to throw out water, particularly like dirty wash water, you would always yell a warning first, so that if any of the good folk were passing by invisibly, you would not hit them with the dirty water, which of course would then offend them, which we don't want to do. But the implication there is clearly they were tangible enough, even if you couldn't see them, that they would be hit by this dirty water and be upset about it. Whereas if they were passing as, fully incorporeal spirits, that would be much less of an issue. So just something to keep in mind when we're talking about the good folk, when you're considering them, thinking about them, that you can have something be tangible and physical and also be invisible at the same time. It's not a contradiction in the folk belief. We today just kind of have this ingrained idea that they are incorporeal, but that's not something we find generally across the material. So I've kind of talked a lot about some of the history of who they are, connections that they have, ways they can appear. They are often associated with particular locations, which I touched on a little bit. There are very famous places that are known to be She, known to be these otherworldly hills. Nakshiana would be Unas. Nachme is Finvaras, also in Galway. Broga, Newgrange, is associated with the Aos Sí, particularly with Angus and the Dagda, which are two of the two-headed Danann. But it was at least at one point understood to be one of the major Sí in the area. And there's also a multitude of smaller ones that are less famous, less well known, but can be found throughout the landscape. And I did mention the idea that there's also islands, there's other locations that are connected to the other world that sort of act as these passageways or anchor points, the fairy trees, the Cran Sí as well. Um, and this can also give people the idea that these beings are kind of anchored into place, that they can only be found in these specific locations. But we have a whole range of stories that talk about them being able to travel, being able to move around and go different places. It's a fairly common belief in the folklore that at particular times of year, they would change their homes. So while we might associate these beings with one particular location and say this is their home, this particular Sí, that would be true, but they would also have another home. And at certain times of year, they would move from one to the other. And these times of year often are referenced as significant holidays. The fire festivals in Ireland, Bealtaine and Samhain, for example, are two of the main ones where the good folk are thought to be much more active, much more out in the world. You're much more likely to encounter them because this is a time when they're kind of traveling and moving around. So we want to be careful not to see them as too stationary, as too anchored to just one place. They are capable of going where they choose to go. That does not change the fact that they do have these home locations. Again, much like the invisible but corporeal thing, it's possible for both of these to be true at the same time, that they have particular locations that are strongly associated with them, but they also have the ability to travel and move around and go different places as they choose to. So a lot of the stories that we have come from interactions that humans have had when the good folk were traveling, when they were going from home to home or they were going from one location to another for a particular purpose. It definitely is something that is seen as possible, and you're most likely to encounter them in these situations and in these circumstances. So I have to wrap up a little bit because I'm getting short on time, but I do want to mention that throughout all the history, going back into the mythology, into the folklore, into the modern accounts, there is a very strong idea of sort of an ingrained connection between humans and the good folk. And no one 100% understands why this is, or why it persists, or the nature of it, or any of that. But there's this idea that for whatever reason, we are prone to encountering them, and they are prone to encountering us. And often these interactions can either benefit both parties or have a negative consequence, usually more often for the human than for the Aos Sí, but can have a negative consequence. So we know, for example, we have a lot of stories, an entire body of stories about the idea that the good folk will take human beings, take living humans or sometimes deceased humans, and incorporate them into their number. Basically, if a human is kidnapped by the good folk have a way to transform that person into one of them. And at that point, then the human cannot leave. You cannot go and return to your own people, your own family. Once you have been turned into one of the Aos Sí, you kind of become limited to that reality. We don't have as many stories that go in the other direction, with members of the Aos Sí being coming human. We do have some folklore about that, though, so it is not entirely outside the range of possibilities. It just is something that is not emphasized as much as the other direction. Now, why this happens, again, there's a lot of theories. We don't know for certain. We just know that it does. We have a lot of stories where the good folk temporarily borrow someone, particularly a midwife or a musician, to fill a purpose that they need filled, but then the person gets to leave and gets to go on and continue living their human life after that. So they don't just take everybody. They don't just keep everybody, even people that they value, like musicians, they will let go again. So there's layers of mystery to this. And of course, I am trying to cover a lot of ground in a fairly short presentation for everyone. But I hope that this has at least piqued people's curiosity and provided a basic understanding of the Aos Sí, of who they are and sort of where they exist in belief. They do still exist in belief today. You can still find people talking about them and having encountered them. Um, Not maybe as much as 100 years ago, but it is still there. It is still active folk belief. And just to quickly wrap up for everyone, if this is a subject that you're very interested in, obviously I myself have written about it, hence why I'm here giving this presentation. But you can also look up a website called Duchas.ie, DUCHAS.ie. It's the schools collection through Dublin College. It's a collection of a range of folklore and stories from the early 20th century. There is a treasure trove of material there on the Sidhe that you can dig into to get a kind of a wider understanding than what I can present in this short talk. You can look to the living folklore, people still in the culture who still have these beliefs. And there are quite a few good books on the market as well by Irish authors, as well as some good websites and social media sites by Irish authors. I do always encourage people to carefully vet those sorts of sources because there's also a lot of nonsense that's out there online. But there are some solid ones as well. Laura O'Brien's a good one. Anthony Murphy is a good one of Mythical Ireland. David Halpin's Circle Stories is a good source. And then there have recently been a range of books for more specific locations that are talking about these beings. So you certainly have ways you can move forward to learn more if the subject interests you, not just in an academic sense. You can apply this to your spirituality, to your own personal belief. Even if you're just curious about it, you definitely have ways you can move forward. And as I said, I have written a book, Pagan Portals Aos Sí, which is specifically just about this topic. That also includes a whole list of references at the end. So if you end up getting that book, you can also go further from there. And I always encourage people to keep digging and to go further. So that wraps up our talk for today. I hope people feel like they got some sort of value out of this and are definitely walking away knowing maybe a little bit more about the topic than they did half an hour ago. I hope everyone has a great day and enjoy the rest of the conference and the other presentations.